We're going to start Islam tonight, unless there was any questions following up on Christianity. We covered some of the basic beliefs on Christianity last time. Not last week, but 2 weeks ago. Was there any final questions on Christianity? Things maybe we didn't...
I wasn't here last week. Could you go over it again?
I wasn't here last week. I was over there, sitting there. I wasn't up here. I was sitting there listening to Glenn do his presentation, which he did a very, very good job.
We visited Israel last week and understand it.
Yeah, I think it's on YouTube. It was good. He did a very, very good job. All right. Islam is a world religion, and it's the second largest religion after Christianity, with about 1.9 to 2 billion. Some say as many as 2.2 billion, depending on what articles you read. And it's pretty much growing in our country faster than people realize. Really among prisoners in prisons is where it really catches a lot of ground. And then of course the ones that get out take it back to their families. But there are some temples and they do have imams throughout our country. And so it is pretty fast growing. Like Christianity being evangelistic, which means we share our faith, Judaism has some of that sharing, but Christianity does more of it, but Islam is right there with them. They try to bring people in and indoctrinate them into the Islamic faith. So it's the second largest religion after Christianity. Now, in your notes, it has 6th century. That's really 7th century because it's in the early 600s when the religion got started in Arabia. Followers are called Muslims. The prophet is known as Muhammad, and he sees himself as the chief prophet of Allah, who is their God. Islam literally means the supreme test to the will of God, or submission, and some translate it as simply peace, which I think that's kind of like an oxymoron when you see how it plays out in their culture. Ishmael descendants are from him. You remember Abraham, by coercion of his wife, in fear of not having a male descendant, encouraged him to go into one of his slave women or servants, and Hagar, and she bore Ishmael. So that was his firstborn child. And then, of course, later on, Sarah became pregnant, and we know had Isaac. But the descendants of Ishmael, Sarah wanted to get him out of the picture, and Hagar. But God blessed Ishmael and told him he would become a great nation also. And his descendants would be like the descendants of Abraham. They would basically fill the earth. And that they have done. So most people who are Arabic or Arabs and so forth trace their lineage back to Ishmael, which is a part of Abraham's lineage. Religion and politics are inseparable, which that means in some parts of Islam, they run their government as a religious government. For example, Iran, their clerics run the government. So they, the Khomeinis and all those people who are in charge, they are strictly adhered to the Quran, and they follow the teachings to the letter, and even Sharia law when it comes to women, how they're treated, and how they're educated and everything else. There are a lot of restrictions that come out of the Quran that they enforce. Whereas if you go in Iraq is populated more so by another group called the Sunnis. The Sunnis are less, religious, although they are, and they go through the ceremonies and have all the prayers and things. But they're not as strict with some of the teachings of the Quran And that sets up a tension between Iran and Iraq. And it's always been since the Ottoman Empire was broke up after World War I. And that's when all the Arab nations were kind of consolidated and helped the Kaisers, Germany, and those fight against the allies of World War I. One of the things that happened was the Ottoman Empire was broken up. And when it broke up, you had these individual Arab states and without any central authority. So what happened, some of the states like Iran became more conservative, sticking with the Quran. Others became more liberal based on their industry and their politics. Arabia is more Sunni than it is, Shia. And Egypt is more, liberal versus conservative versus Iran. So what happened since World War I is if the allies and other world leaders wanted to deal with these Arab nations, particularly with the oil, or to deal with them on political matters and, infighting or whatever, then what the allies' policy was to arm and support a certain side, because they'll fight each other. They hate each other. These groups really hate each other. And they'll only come together if there's a threat to them externally. For example, when ISIS was created, that was a misfit group that many people believe it was CIA prompt set up and so forth. But when ISIS was formed, they had no land. They had no nationality. It was just a rebel group. In fact, there was more people than just Arabs fighting for them. And they claimed they were fighting for, the liberation of the Quran and, going back to basics. But they became a threat to Iran and to Iraq, blowing up places. So Iran actually joined with Iraq to fight ISIS. And it was a unique experience because ISIS was not ever a part of the division. They were kind of like a group of radical terrorists that all of a sudden was being funded and had the resources and just popped up and was creating tension for a lot of the other Arab nations like Syria and different ones trying to topple their governments. And so one of the things that our administration, so they say, did was to, and Trump helped with some of this, was to basically dry up the resources going to this group of ISIS and target the people who were leaders in it, and with drone kills and everything else. So they gradually, it's still out there, but it's not the force that it was before. But what I'm trying to bring into is that is made up of Islamic people, but those people are very, very radical versus many of the others who are part of Islam. Let's talk about Muhammad. He's an interesting character. Before Islam was birthed, and if you like to read, and you like to read things that you don't hear about in the news and you don't hear about in school, but you would like to know, all right, I'd like to know a little bit more. Well, I encourage you to go to Google and Google this: the Catholic Church and the formation of Islam. Now, I told somebody this a few weeks ago when we were talking about some of this. You're going to be surprised. There's a lot of evidence in history to support the idea that the Catholic Church helped to get Islam off the ground, and because they needed more help, because their goal was to open the trade routes to the Far East. And in establishing a different religion to balance against all the tribes, because before Islam came into being, the Arabs, they were basically tribal people, and there was, hundreds and thousands of them. They were tribal, so they went by heads of their tribes, led their group, and they would not join with or participate with other tribes. In fact, they had factions and would fight with each other. Now, this is before Islam. Their religion was polytheistic, which means they had multiple gods, and each tribe had their own unique gods, and so that set them apart. So with their religions, they were constantly saying their gods were superior to the other tribe's gods, and so there was infighting. All right. Meanwhile, over here if we look at the Middle East, and this is, my famous map, north of here was Syria, and then of course north of that was Turkey, today Turkey, but then it was, and of course you had Constantinople or Istanbul over here and in the sea. Well, there were trade routes that went back into this area and back over here to India, and the east of the Western cultures, Europe, the Roman Empire, the Western Empire, they were very interested in getting the silks. There's some books been written. I read one of them. It's called The Silk Road, the Silk Highway. And that was a big, because the rich people in the Roman Empire in Europe, they liked fancy stuff. And so when some of the silks came back with Marco Polo and others, through the years, they really wanted this stuff. And they knew at that time, out here to come around Africa and sell around there, those routes hadn't been opened yet. So if you were going to get to the Middle East and get into these resources, and it was not just silk, it was other precious metals and ivory, because there's a lot of elephants in North India at the time, and there was just jade and different things like that. Then the Chinese, of course, centuries later had the development of gunpowder and things like that. So the Catholic Church, desiring to bring this trade route, and you got to remember, they were the political power and force in Western culture. So their goal was to keep these trade routes open, because what happened with these tribes, they were arrayed in different ones, but it wasn't the same tribe all the time. So there was no consolidation of power, and to send traders on this route, they call it the Silk Road, was a dangerous affair, and very seldom did stuff come back. Now, in the 1400s, when they started exploring with ships and everything else, they eventually opened some sea routes around Africa, and then eventually, the Suez Canal was built a long time later, but they were able to get and go by sea, but that's a treacherous route. This was still the shortest way to the Middle East, but it was about gold. It was about precious metals. It was about, like I said, cloth and things like that. And these things were very valuable. So what happened around the early 600s was Muhammad somehow was given some resources. And, they attribute it to him, but when you read a biography about him, of any knowledgeable biographies, you'll find he was a very illiterate man. He couldn't read and write. And yet they attribute the Quran to him. And here's the interesting thing, because he married a lady by the name of Khadijah. She was 15 years older than him. She was a princess of one of these tribes. And she was very literate. She could write. And the Islamic people hate for this information to get out, but it's there. Most people and scholars, and even some Arabs, will tell you that she was the actual writer of the Quran, and that Muhammad, set himself up as the prophet and, as God's designated prophet. Now, that being said, you say, well, what would be the agenda of Islam? Well, when he set this up, he went to monotheism, which means one God, and they call him Allah. And that takes away from these tribes. If there's only one God, then it consolidates the power. Because instead of one tribe fighting another god, gods or tribes or whatever, because religion is what people believe, and they had their beliefs in each tribe and stuff. By consolidating to one God, he said that would essentially take away the division among Arabs and consolidate their power, so they would have more forces to stop the invasion of the West back across here, and eventually to keep them out of Jerusalem. Now, that being said, to be able to do this would take time. So he formed armies, got them trained to fight. They use horses and swords and spears and things. And he did that, and then he would gradually take over one tribe after another and make them a part of Islam, and by force. And so when we get into some of the teachings, Islam says you can join us and denounce your religion and recognize Allah as one God, in other words, convert. Or you can be put to death for resisting. Or number 3, you can live with us in peace, not attack us, but live with us in peace, but you have to pay a tax to the Islamic government wherever you're living. That's your 3 choices spelled out in the Quran. So them killing their enemies was no problem. And they saw it as a way to honor Allah. We'll come to this later, but it's called a jihad. And a jihad is a struggle, to please Allah. And in that struggle, you can even sacrifice yourself. But if you fight the enemies of Allah, then you're in that struggle. And by doing this, if you die in a jihad, a designated jihad, then you automatically bypass all the 5 pillars we'll come to in a minute. You go straight into paradise. So it's a shortcut. And young men are radicalized to do that. But we'll get into that more detail later. But he chose this. Now, watch this. To get into these tribes and to, because a lot of these tribes some of them had walled cities where they stayed, and then they would go out and raid places and come back. So what he did was infiltrate people and create cells of his people within the cities of where the other tribes were. And they were instructed to live there in peace, not cause any trouble. And to such time, a jihad is called for, and then they're to rise up and united together overthrow the tribal chief and their regime. And so that technique is still being used today. The FBI and CIA and all of them, track these cell units around. It's a part of their plan to infiltrate. The word assassin comes from the Arabic language into the English. One of their major techniques of taking over tribal kings was to put these cells in here and then actually find a way to infiltrate the palaces and then kill the leader. Once the leader went down, it usually broke the chain of command within the tribe, and the tribe fell apart, and then he'd come in with his forces and take over. It didn't take him long that his numbers swelled to the hundreds of thousands. Now, when you read your stuff about Catholicism, one of the things that happens in our world when it comes to military and powers that want to rule the world and things like that, is that if you're going to get people to fight, you got to create a cause. You got to give them a justifiable cause and have what they call poster board faces or enemies for you to attack and to do away with. So I can't think of the year right offhand, but it was one of the popes, and I'll have to look it up. He called for a holy war because these trade routes were being blocked by the rise of Islam. And by having Islam, now he had a face to deal with. Instead of saying, we got to go after this tribe or that tribe, he said, let's go after the Arabs, period. And so he put out a decree in Europe and said to the knights, those who were special forces, I call them, he put out a decree, and that's where the Templar Knights or Knight Templars came from. And they were special forces, and he told them that if they would go and lead armies in there and take back the Holy Land, get the artifacts that were here and bring them back to Europe, that he would reward them handsomely with land. Because back then, land was the monetary exchange value. So to own land made you very wealthy. So the knights did that, and they took armies in there. Now, I'm jumping ahead, and the reason I want to show you how this comes together. When the first crusade took place, it was somewhere around 1000 AD. That's a long time after this. And when it took place, there was they estimate over 60,000 people through France and Europe, all of Europe, Germany, a lot of these knights, plus the Templar Knights, they all headed toward Jerusalem. But they had to come by through Constantinople. Well, Constantinople was controlled by the eastern part of the church, and they were not buddies with the western part, so they wouldn't help them. So when they got here, they resisted them, and so they bypassed them and came in on this way and came in and landed, and came down to Jerusalem. Well, the first crusade was successful, but these crusades went on for 300 years, and they used the Arabs as a means of justifying forces coming in here, stabilizing the trade routes, opening them up, and at the same time using religious purposes to get people to do it. And they said you could have your sins absolved if you went on one of these crusades. So people thinking, well, hey, I'm having a hard time playing all these penances. What? I'll be an adventurer. I'll go fight, whatever. Well, most of them never came back. The other thing that happened to them is they traveled across the land. They had no resources, no logistical backup, no food. So where did they get their food? Like the Yankees did when they came through Georgia and Carolina. They lived off people's land, stole their animals, raped their women and everything else. So they had a bad reputation, the Crusaders, with the people they were coming through. Although they'd pick up some people, there were people actually trying to fight them on the way there. It was not a pretty picture. And every time a crusade, but it was a dictate from the Pope. Urban II is his name. And Urban put out this, that he got a vision from God that they need to fight these things. So that being said, there's evidence that the Catholic Church helped initiate this for the simple fact of getting a target group that they can attack and negotiate with. And they did try to negotiate with the Arabs. There's a good movie called The Kingdom of God. If you ever want to watch it, it's kind of violent. The Kingdom. How many of anybody y'all seen that movie? Excellent movie. It shows you all this. And there's a funny part in there because the Arabs have surrounded Jerusalem, and it's based on the First Crusade, it's true. And they have Jerusalem surrounded, and they're under siege. And the guy who's in charge, because the king died from something, but anyway, he was in charge, and he said, we're just going to leave the city. Let them have it. It's not worth it. And the priest came out and said, oh, it is where it's God's city. It's got God's artifacts. This was the Catholic priest, And he says, no, we're going to negotiate. And he said, because there's 250,000 of them and there's less than 100,000 of us and we're mostly women and children, he said it'd be a slaughter. It's not worth it. Give them Jerusalem. That's what they want. So in the movie, the priest and him go out to meet the imam, and when they go out to meet him, he says, we're fixing to destroy the city. And the priest whispered to the guy, said, why don't we go ahead and convert to Islam? And then when it's all over, we'll convert back to Christianity. And we'll negotiate that way. And he says, no, we're giving them the city. So I say all that to say this religion is a violent religion. It was formed for that purpose, to consolidate these tribes. And there is evidence to say that the Catholic Church wanted this because it gave them a target and it gave them justification to get people riled up to go clean them out. And but in either case, that backfired because a few centuries later they almost took over Europe. And there was a battle in Spain that if the Europeans had lost that battle, we'd be speaking Arab today. That's how close it came. Because the next time they came back with larger forces, but it was centuries later when that happened. But having said all that, Muhammad is the prophet. He is the one who, along with his wife, put the book together. He got a divine revelation when he was 40. It's called Rasulullah, which means messenger of God. He was persecuted by other tribes who thought that he was crazy. And so he had a hard time at first getting started. The Hijrah, which is a migration of Muhammad and some of his followers secretly to Medina. They got into Medina, which means flight. He was able to subdue Mecca, which is another center in the Arab countries, and he gained further power there. He unified the Arab states under a theocracy, which means Allah is in control, and his tribal loyalties united under Ummah, which is another word for church. So he created Arabic Ummahs, or tribes with imams to rule in a smaller fashion. So that being said, his organization is very similar to the Catholic Church, where you have, a bishop or an archbishop, and then you have priests and so forth. Well, then he had these different imams under him and had local areas called ummahs that answered to him, and then they would hold meetings where he held them accountable for their activities and things like that. Some of their beliefs, of course, Allah, which means the God. He's all-powerful, transcendent God. He is creator. He controls every detail. He is a personal being. Muezzin calls Muslims to prayer daily. That's what a muezzin is, someone who's in the tower. If you're over in one of those countries where they have a tower, and they would sound off the alarm and, for them to pray, and 5 times a day, and they would roll out their little mats. I think I shared with y'all maybe last year when we were talking a little bit about this. One of my racquetball buddies was Islamic, and he ran a barbershop, and he also had 2 clothing businesses. He was pretty well off. And during Ramadan, which was in the summer, it's 40 days of fasting, 40 days of, solitude and things like that. He wouldn't play racquetball. I'd call him and say, "Where are you at?" He said, "I'm going through Ramadan. I don't eat much. I don't have much energy." And he said, "I can't do that." Then one day toward the end of Ramadan, he came in, and I noticed a little mat rolled up by his bag of stuff. And I asked him, he says, "I just came out of a prayer, and I just didn't have time to put it up, so I just brought it in here." And I kind of made a little joke about it, because we had to compete against each other. And I said, when we're playing, don't be hollering out Allah Akbar, because I said, that gets me riled up, And he looked at me, he didn't like what I said, and I was just trying to make a joke. Probably shouldn't have done that. Might have had my bag with a bomb in it, blow me up, I don't know. But anyway, he is a personal being. God has spoken through prophets, and other than Muhammad, but Muhammad is his chief prophet. There were 4 caliphs after Muhammad died, and the struggle for leadership among the Muslims was violent and divisive. So imagine Muhammad being the key leader of Islam, and almost like Supreme Court Justice or Moses in the a Jewish situation. He was the supreme mouthpiece for Allah, so what he said went. But when he died, you had 4 caliphs, which is another word to describe leaders, that split off. And what happened was the reversal of Islam started taking place. They still believed in Allah. They still had the Quran, which we'll come to that and how he wrote it and stuff. But what happened is different factions broke off. And when they broke off, trying to vie for power over the whole Islamic nation, they actually started fighting each other. So you had these conservatives, which would be the Shias or Shiites, and then you had the Sunnis, and then you had, what's the third group? I got it listed here, but I have to look it up. Another group, and then underneath them, you had several other splinter groups. And so they were constantly at each other's throat trying to get power, that Muhammad had. The Mongol Empire suppressed Islam for a while, but after the leader was converted to Islam, the Mongols lost control. Now, without drawing a big map, imagine this is Mongolia, China, then you've got what we know as Russia, or the Asian area up here where Russia was. Well, the Mongol Empire became very powerful, and they raided all through here, all the way down into this area, and were very powerful for a long time. And they fought Islam and kept them at bay for many years. And finally, one of the Mongol leaders was converted to Islam, and when he did, the fighting between those 2 large groups stopped. And, for a while there was peace between the 2. And then the Mughal Muslims are in India. So there is a Muslim faction, even though you have Hindus, there is a Muslim faction in India. They trace their ancestry back to Ishmael through Abraham. They believe good and evil are constantly battling. So good versus evil is a part of what they call their belief system, or to use the fancy word, their cosmology, that in the universe you have forces of good fighting the forces of evil. Muhammad learned much from Judaism. Now, I'm going to throw something else out here for you when you're doing, if you like to do more research. If you study Catholicism very carefully in its formation, it got a lot of its practices from Judaism. The priesthood is like the Pharisees. The rituals and the laws and the things that they saw in the Bible to control people like the Pharisees did. And when you look at Catholicism, it looks like it was formed out of Judaism as far as some of the things that are there. And you got these three major religions in that area, and Muhammad borrowed some of those things and brought it into Islam. This happens with Mormonism. It happens with every religion. Practically, you have this mixing of ideas that have come through the time, and they put them together and form these new religions. They believe Jesus was also a prophet of God, but they reject him as being deity. So he's not God. So when that preacher in California said that somehow Islam and Christianity could merge together because we have the same God, it's a lie. It's a lie. Because they deny that Jesus is God. Allah, there's only one God, and they say that in their statements. All right, I haven't been advancing my sheet up there. Let me see if I can catch up. Been following my handout more than I have that. Okay, next one. The role of women. They consider men and women are equal before God, but the actual result is women are oppressed. And in many of these Arab countries, they're not even allowed to get educated. You remember the little girl that was in, was it Afghanistan, that she became kind of the poster girl? She was wanting to get her education, and the government was fighting it, and finally I think she won, and there was some kind of liberation. For her. But in a lot of the Arab countries, women are held back from learning. Their dress code is extreme. They're not to show any flesh. Their length of their robes have to be to a certain point. Even our military that travel in those areas, the women are instructed, our soldiers, what they can wear and not wear. And it's very restrictive toward women. There's Sharia law. There was a movie on Netflix based on a true story of a young girl that her dad was mistreating her at home, actually beating her because she was trying to liberate herself from some of these beliefs. And, the people in the town was trying to help her. And there's a big push. A lot of these Islamic people are coming to America living in their own neighborhoods, and they want to see their neighborhoods be set apart from the rest of the county or the rest of the city and be able to practice their own laws, which they refer to as Sharia law, and so they can punish their wives if they need to without any interference, punish criminals if they steal, cut their hands off, without trial. They are wanting to see this happen. In some parts of our country, there's been a big lawsuits going on between our government or law versus theirs, and they're trying to use the Constitution to justify it. This is our religious beliefs. What do y'all think about that? Do you think the First Amendment guarantees them to be able to live like that? What does the First Amendment say?
Freedom of religion, but
This is their religion.
you gotta have freedom of the individual first.
All right.
Freedom of the individual, being a man or a woman, married or unmarried.
One of the first altercations with our Navy after we became a nation was in Tripoli. And there were Marines on our 3 ships. They were sent there because the pirates off the coast of North Africa were robbing our merchant ships. So our government sent, and I can't remember the president, Thomas Jefferson sent 3 ships. And when he sent the ships, there were some Marines on there. And they were successful in freeing up some of the ships and getting them out of there.
600 miles overland to get
Yeah, and they were victorious. And so when you hear the Marine anthem, from the shores of to the halls of Missouri to the shores of Tripoli, and of course Montezuma was the Mexican conflict, but the founding fathers. Now I'm just going to give you my perspective. I've read a lot on the Constitution, and the original intent's one of the best books you can ever read on how the original, what they really were talking about when they wrote it down. It's the context of their times. They did not foresee an America with everything under the sun being accepted as religion, particularly Satanism and stuff, and Islam. They knew there were different versions of Christianity because they had experienced it in Europe. And they wanted America to be a country of toleration. So at that time, in the world that was going on, Islam was not even on the radar screen. It was there, and they knew it was there, and they had issues with some things, but they were not threatened by the concept that Islamic communities would rise up in America. Neither was Satanism. I mean, my goodness, they were hanging and burning people at stake for witchcraft, so they weren't concerned about Satanism. They weren't concerned about any of the cults. Their concern was the Catholic Church, number one. That the Catholic Church would do what they did in Europe, take away the freedom of people to worship. So they made it clear, if you come to the colonies and you bring your religion with you, you're not going to be able to be subversive with your teachings. Everybody can worship their God as they want. So among the Protestants, you had Baptists, Methodists, you had the New Lights, you had the Amish, you had the Mennonites, you had groups of the New Hollanders, you had Free Will Baptists, and then of course Particular Baptists, and you had all these groups. You had the Huguenots, they settled in Charleston, and they were considered Protestant. So you had these different groups coming, and they left it up to the colonies to decide how you're going to treat these groups. And then when the Constitution was formulated, it said no government church could be formed in the country that was supported financially with people's taxes or would prevent others from worshiping with freedom of conscience. Now, through the years, with the world becoming smaller and America being invaded by peoples from all over the world, a melting pot, we've reached a turning point where these religions have taken hold and there's enough people here. And so under the First Amendment, they're actually petitioning the courts to justify their behaviors under their religion. The Native Americans fought the federal government for years, and they finally won on smoking peyote and some other things because that was a part of their religious ceremonies. Those were illegal drugs. And they finally won, on their reservations. And now marijuana's become legal, so it's similar to that, maybe a little more potent. But my point is, under the religious First Amendment, religion has made headway, and some of these religions are flourishing again. That our founding fathers they'd turn over in their graves if they saw this. They could never foresee this happening. Trust me, there's just no way. That was not in the original intent. It's just like the Second Amendment with the guns. There's people who tried to reinterpret that and says, well, our founding fathers never knew they would be AR-15s and machine guns and, bazookas or whatever. And so they go back and say, that Second Amendment doesn't guarantee us the right to hold those things. Well, that's not what it says. The original intent was we have a right to defend ourselves, to bear arms, form a militia for the defense of our country. And a standing army was not a part of our original Constitution. It was the militias. We would rise up and defend our homeland, and that's a guaranteed right. So, but there's liberal interpreters that say, well, no, they because we got AR-15s and stuff, that's not if they had AR-15s back then, tell me, they would use them. When you got a horde of Indians coming after you, they would have used them, and they would have used them against the British. They would have used them, against the Yankees. And as weaponry developed, we have a right, self-defense. But I'm bringing that all out because Islam is making headways in our country. All right.
If they want to live like that, why didn't they stay where they were?
Good point.
That's it. They should abide by the law of the land. If they want that law, go to their land.
All right, but get this. Under the Constitution, every state is a separate country. And the only thing that holds us together is the Constitution. So South Carolina can't tell an Arab, the way it's being interpreted today, that you can't practice your religious beliefs. But if you beat your wife, yeah, our laws say you can't do that. But if you never hear about that because they don't let you into their area because they've declared it under Sharia law that whoever lives in that community has to live under Sharia law, and there's some state governments are beginning to cave in, and I'm like you, send them back home. But many of them come here for educational purposes, but a lot of them come here for other agendas, and the point being, we have this tension between this religion and our culture, which is Christian. And it's becoming a big issue in some areas. And we'll finish with this right here. The 5 pillars of Islam. A pillar is basically just referring like you support a building, a column. So the 5 supports of the faith of Islam, for you to be a good Islamic person, to be a Muslim that pleases Allah, here's what you have to do. You have to have first a profession of faith in Allah. And the Quran states how you have to say it, just like we have a creed that some people say. Then there has to be periods of fasting, like during Ramadan and some other seasons during the year. Then there has to be prayer. 5 times a day, you pray toward Mecca, which, for us is back toward the east, southeast. And they have to have these prayers 5 times a day, wherever they are. If your job prevents you from going to the local mosque that's in town, then, you can find a way. And of course, I guess you'd have to tell your employee, have y'all ever worked with people that actually did the 5 prayers a day? Any of y'all? Well, how did they get by with taking time to pray? Did anybody give them just on their break? How much time did they take,
The ones that I was associated with was just maybe 5 minutes.
And the Jews would pray 3 times a day. And we learned that from the book of Daniel and some other passages. But the Islamic people, it's the 5 times a day. And they have to face the east. And if you're in one of those countries, there's a, shofar or something sounds to let you know it's time to do that. Then at some time in their life, they have to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, which they believe that's where Muhammad's spirit went back toward, paradise with Allah, which they added that kind of later, Mecca or Medina. And to go there is fulfilling your pilgrimage and your devotion, to Allah. And then almsgiving, which is a type of tithing. You give regularly to the support of the local mosque. And I don't know the designated amounts, but if you don't give, then of course that takes away your potential. It is a works religion. If you fail in these things, then you're not going to make it. You're going to fall short of Allah's expectations. So a good practicing Muslim, does the best that they can. Now, just like the 10 Commandments, these 5 pillars can be expanded. Because if you break them down and look at the personal lives, for example, that profession of faith means that you're going to repent of sin and practice purity with your life, which is supposed to be no drinking, no pornography, no going to juke joints. And it's funny because all these terrorists, they claim that the night before they do their terrorist work, they actually are seen in bars drinking and with women. And people scratch their head and says, well, I thought they're trying to be holy. Well, keep in mind, they're doing a jihad where they're sacrificing themselves for Allah. This goes away. The 5 pillars go away. It's like pass and go and getting $200. And so it's an easy route out of this earth without having to keep up with all of this. And so the imams radicalize the young guys because they're struggling going through puberty, trying to keep themselves pure and trying to stay from all these temptations. And then, of course, the imam throws in there, well, there's an easy way out. Of course, he words it different. You can devote yourself to Allah and actually die in a jihad fighting his enemies, and your personal struggle with sin is over. because the actual keeping of these 5 pillars is considered a struggle, a jihad. You know, you've heard Paul say it in Romans 7 that things he didn't want to do, he did, and things, you know, he wanted to do, he didn't do, and, you know, and he kind of described the Christian struggle. Well, that's similar to this. Trying to keep all of the laws of the Quran would be so difficult, and particularly for a young person, it would be easier for them to take the easy route out and blow themselves up. Plus, they make it, sweeten it up, saying we'll give your parents X number of dollars, we'll take care of your family, you know, we'll get them a house and whatever. So they sweeten the pot here for their descendants. And so for a poor Arab struggling to make ends meet and trying to fulfill the law of Islam, and he may be a little psychotic, it's easy for him to get emotionally charged up and to actually blow himself up. Very few times women have done it. They're less likely to be involved, but they do that. But not as much as young men in doing that. Okay, any comments or questions? We'll stop right there. I'll make a little note.